Hello, James Lowman from the Association of Convenience Stores. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Convenience Talks. I think you're now, is it 3 times I've spoken to you now?
At least I would say. No, thanks for having me. It's always good to talk to you. Always.
Oh, thank you. And just briefly, for anyone out there that's watching this episode and is thinking, who the hell is James Lowman? They obviously don't do a lot of work in the convenience.
Very sensitive.
Who the hell are you?
Who the hell am I? So I'm Chief Executive of the Association of Convenience Stores. So there's 46,000 convenience stores in the UK, and we represent them to government. There's more to it than that, but that's the sort of summary of it. So I suppose you could see as many of your audience will be very familiar with UK hospitality, for example. So I suppose you can view us as like that organisation, but for convenience stores, local shops, including things like petrol forecourts. Some are in train stations, city centres, but most convenience stores are actually in neighbourhoods, secondary areas, housing estates, villages. That's really our heartland, and that's where we've been probably particularly important during this crisis.
Thank you, James. Now, when we last spoke, we had a conversation about the issues of the day, which at that point we were a few weeks into lockdown, and those issues were things like availability and getting stock on shelves and actually the supply chain. And then the idea of physical distancing being brought in. Where do we sit with those issues in the convenience industry now? I mean, are we at a stage whereby it's accepted and it's okay and it's working well? Do we still have any challenges there? And have any of those things provided any kind of opportunity for change as well within the industry?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I mean, those problems haven't gone away. And funnily enough, I think maybe some of the supply issues where I seem to spend a huge amount of time in April and May talking about supply issues. Basically our members had this real spike in demand, and we can't get the product to replenish on the shelves. And there's, the supermarkets had a spike in demand, and so just filling all those gaps put huge pressure on the supply chain, and actually particularly in some of the alcohol categories, particularly beer, actually, because as I've learned through this, that keg lines can't be repurposed for other packaging of packs of beer and so on. So that was really just lost. Mm-hmm. And there was this demand, 30% of product that's of food and drink that's bought in the on trade, and hospitality. Obviously, that went down to basically zero straight away. And so customers bought that 30% from shops. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's now slowly coming back. So we had that huge sort of spike in demand, and it was difficult to get hold of that product into our stores. Our members weren't getting the supplies they needed into the stores. It's not gone away as an issue. I mean, it's still it's better than it was. It's not the acute problem it was. You haven't got as many shortages in as many areas, but it's still a challenge. Our members are still struggling to get products on shelf, and part of that is actually for a really good reason for us, which is that when the supermarkets have that big sort of spike, I don't know which way you look from your perspective, is you have a big sort of spike in demand and whatever. And then they sort of went back to a bit more normal, what's really above the levels they're at, because 30% was out of hospitality and into retail. But we sort of spiked a little bit after that, but we never really went back down, and convenience stayed at much higher levels of trade than even supermarkets proportionate year on year for quite a long period of time. I think things have come back a little bit now, probably as much due to weather actually as due to COVID-related factors. And there will be a movement back towards hospitality as that starts to open, obviously in quite a limited way now. So some of that 30% will start to move back. But yeah, the convenience sector continues to trade well ahead, but that continues to bring some issues in terms of getting consistency and full supply into those stores.
And did you, and obviously the distancing recommendations have now gone down from the 2 meters to the 1 meter with precautions. Do you think that that distancing change has affected stores in any way?
No, very specific answer on that. Most members didn't change their policies in store because in a way, I suppose it's a reasonably fluid environment, and they felt that 2 meters had got quite well understood. And so, in terms of like physically where the tape was on floors, the signage that was up, you'll find an example where someone did change their policies, but most of our members kept talking about 2 meters in terms of the store. And maybe, they probably all moved to a point where they weren't being quite as officious in sort of trying to enforce it. So maybe a bit more leeway in terms of how they're thinking about trying to implement that in store. But yeah, basically they kept the same policy. So no, there wasn't a huge change. Whereas obviously for hospitality, huge difference, because that meant that things could operate on a totally different basis to how they would have done with 2 meters, which would have made it, it would have made it more than twice as difficult. Obviously, as Kate and others rightly and very articulately said.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're now faced with, so we've still got some of the challenges we originally had that we spoke about at the beginning of lockdown. We're now faced with additional challenges, in so much as the compulsory mask wearing that came in last Friday. Obviously, we've just had the obesity strategy released as well. What are your thoughts on both of those things, and what are you hearing from your members? I mean, the mask thing has worried me immediately, because staff just simply aren't trained to enforce facial coverings on people. So what is it looking like out there with less than a week gone?
Yeah, so we were advising members in the run-up to this. The policy we were talking about was communicate but don't challenge. Right. And the reason for that is this is now government policy. It makes it's right to do, it's proportionate to communicate that and explain that's the policy to people, to produce posters and stuff like that. It's gone down really well, which we're pleased about.
Right.
But don't challenge, because last year there were 50,000 incidents of violence in convenience stores, and that's a massive underrepresentation. We're far more than that, unfortunately. So we know that there are flashpoints for incidents in store. They are underage sales, or asking for someone's proof of age when they don't want to be asked,
right?
And or theft, or try to intervene when someone's stealing something.
Yeah.
And so particularly because a lot of people have addiction problems and so on and so forth, those can escalate very quickly into violence. The last thing we wanted was to create another flashpoint, another potential flashpoint in store. So that's why we're saying communicate the policy, but don't challenge. And one of the reasons it's also very hard to challenge is that there are lots of very good reasons why someone may not be able to wear a face mask, or a face covering. I was trying to use that language. But
yeah, sorry, face covering.
Yeah, I'll keep going to that. So, for example, hidden disabilities, particularly. Also, if you're working a shift in the convenience store, particularly if you're behind a screen, if you're not on the shop floor for long periods of time, it's not actually comfortable wearing a face mask for a long period of time. Whereas if you and I are going to a shop for 10 minutes, it's not a biggie, and we can do that. Most people can do that.
Doing an 8-hour shift with something that more often than not is hooked around your ears as well, which is really painful. And that must be awful.
So one of these things as well, where even though face coverings are recommended for colleagues, rightly, that's absolutely fine, they're not compulsory, and there may be good reasons why colleagues aren't wearing them as much, particularly say when they're not in those areas. So you can imagine some situations there where you either challenge someone not wearing a face covering, and there's a good reason why they haven't. You challenge someone and they say, well, you're not, that your colleague there is not wearing a face covering, why should I? So we just want to eliminate those flashpoints as much as possible. The feedback from what's happened over the first few days, most people are wearing face coverings, but there's a decent minority that's not, that aren't. And actually the biggest issue has been customers challenging other customers rather than the retailer intervening. So and this happened actually when the 2 meters came in initially, that the people would be saying, you're too close to me, and then an argument sort of kicks off. So those things again kick off. And I understand it, why, if you're wearing a mask, and particularly if you've got sensitivities because yourself or because your family members or friends and you're worried about them, I can see why people get quite indignant and quite genuinely upset about that. So members trying to sort of handle those issues without escalating them, that's been the real challenge. And the good news is most convenience stores, and including multiple groups actually with managers, but particularly independents, have already got good pre-existing relationships with their community, with their customer base. So it's like in a pub, isn't it? I mean, I remember I used to work in a pub years ago. I was a student, and I always felt very confident because there are a bunch of people in there who were there a lot of the time. I knew them well, so I thought, well, you felt you're sort of well backed up and supported. And the same kind of goes in a lot of local shops. There's that sort of community support for them. So they can have a lot of those informal conversations with people, and they can sort of, without having to train it necessarily, they can kind of deflect with humour. They can know when to ignore. Nonetheless, there's still a risk of it being a flashpoint. So we probably rather we weren't in a position of having to sort of deal with this. But we're very clear, we are not the enforcement agency. That is the police. And this notion you get about, if you caught, so what happens when you call the police? I mean, and will the police turn up? I mean, if even incidents of violence in convenience stores, it's set in normal times, you don't get flashing blue lights turning up in 3 or 4 minutes. It doesn't. I'm afraid it should happen, but it doesn't.
No.
So there's a sort of fancy world people are in about level of police response, I'm afraid. So yeah, feedback's been, most people are wearing, some aren't. Most of the issues are customer to customer. Touch wood, I haven't yet heard of any serious incidents in member stores, but there's 46,000 of them, so, you know, law of averages, something might have happened, but I haven't heard anything specific come up. I think you asked about obesity strategy, didn't you?
Yeah, so the obesity strategy that was presented to us by, obviously, our slim fit Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. What I mean, obviously, this is going to have a big effect on trade, on off trade. You know, this is something that they're hoping will have a fundamental change in the health of the nation. But in the meantime, seems to not have been introduced at the ideal time for two industries that are, you know, trying to keep themselves going and keep people fed and employed and watered and happy. So I'd just love to know what the thoughts are on it.
Yeah. So I mean, first thing to say, you know, obesity is a real problem. You know, I think it's really important when you're, you know, industry, business organisations look at this. You've got to sort of, there are some issues where you think, well, why has anyone made a priority of that? What doesn't make any sense? It does make sense to make a priority of tackling obesity because it is a significant problem. It was before COVID, and is it when? And you know, within that, lots of subsets of issues: childhood obesity, adult obesity, particular comorbidities with COVID. But ultimately, this is a real problem. It seems perfectly legitimate that governments look at ways to tackle this. It then comes down to is what's being proposed the right stuff? Is this actually going to, and will it be effective? And I suppose I had to approach it with a degree of cynicism. A lot of these ideas have been consulted on, trial, discussed before. A lot of these aren't as new as they're maybe being made out. So, you know, I'm not convinced that all these measures will be effective. For us, I suppose we particularly focus on the things that have the biggest impact on retail operations. And there are probably two of those that are particularly relevant. There's the promotions, specifically on promotions. Now, there aren't a lot of buy one, get one frees going on at the moment. So this is a bit of a sort of, you know, 2008 sort of solution, you know, or problem they're trying to tackle.
Do you think that's one of the reasons that the government have suggested this at this time, is that they're thinking, well, people have already been weaned off those promotions a little bit anyway, so maybe it's not going to hit people so hard when they're banned or when they're avoided?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there's still quite a lot of volume. I mean, volume related promotions aren't just buy one get one free, so there could be some other extra free and so on. So there's some challenges around that, and I think the issue is not so much about the volume promotions, to be honest, but the issue we have with some promotional restrictions, or the concern about that, is that we're going to come out of this probably into some sort of price war. It's quite likely because you've got supermarkets have built up war chests around this time. You saw from the last recession, that's when the discounters really grew significantly, became major players. And, you know, there's a lot of people worried about their household finances. So you understand why they're going to be looking for value. One of the ways that we compete when price moves up the agenda is through promotions, because it's hard for us in our sector to compete head to head on every SKU, every price, clearly. So promotional benefits, so it could limit our ability to do that. So that's a concern. And it is also, and I appreciate they are different things, but, you know, it's interesting that it would have been a logical thing maybe if this is a big focus, that when we introduce Eat Out to Help Out as of next week, but there might have been some restrictions on that. So there might be some sort of sense of, well, this applies to certain products and others. Now, I get the simplicity and the attraction of saying that applies to everything, apart from booze. So that goes, you know, I get that, that's sort of fine. But, it's, you know, there's a massive contradiction. On the one hand, we're going to limit promotions. On the other hand, we're going to say we're going to actually run the biggest promotion that has ever been run in this country. Well, I hope it is, because that means it's being effective. It is, but will be Eat Out to Help Out in August. So there's that whole promotions area. The thing that concerns us more is about siting restrictions, or promotions by location, as they call it. Yeah. And there's still a lot to go here. We've got a lot of more conversations to have to see what the legislation you actually want to bring forward. But the nightmare, and it is a bit of a nightmare for Amazon, I'm trying to overstate it, is that in a small store, you're told that you can't put quite a broad range of products. You know, the majority of what you sell in a lot of stores, you can't put that at the till, at an aisle end, at an entrance to the store. You take away those areas, there's not much shop left, and you can't put a whole bunch of products in those areas. So at the worst that could come through, that will be a massive challenge for our industry. You know, that would be a real game changer. And the thing that my sort of angle on this is, I talked very beginning, talked about convenience stores and where we operate. That, the places where we operate, housing estates, villages, often reasonably, not remote, but slightly cut off areas in some cases. And the equation isn't, do we have this convenience store which does sell tobacco, alcohol, sugar, salt, fat? We do sell those things. Okay, a lot of our products do have those things in, but also, as well as that, sells those other things as well, and has that, including healthier products, and provides that community touch point and service, which has obviously been particularly valuable in the last few months. You either have that, or you don't have that shop there at all. Now, I'm not saying this is going to shut down thousands of stores. I think those levels of siting restrictions would have a significant impact on our sector. I don't know, I'm not going to come up with a number of how many shops were closed down, but I think it's a real thing. You either have that store or you don't. The equation isn't to say, we have this store selling all these products, or we have this wonderful organic farm shop only selling these wonderful healthy fruit and veg, locally. So that's not the equation. If those stores are going to set up, they'd already have set up, and that facility remains, including selling healthier options. It only remains there to sell everything else. Yeah. So I do worry about, and I don't want to get all apocalyptic about it, because retailers adapt. We've learned that in the last few months more than ever. But yeah, anything which makes it harder to trade in those sorts of locations just seems to be a bad thing for society and for health, actually, as well as for obviously for our members who we're speaking for. So yeah, the obesity strategy will be a big focus for us in the coming months.
Good. Okay. Well, I look forward to following what you do there, and I guess as a bit of a knock-on effect of that strategy, but also just the coronavirus situation in general. There's we've recently worked with New Trade on a report about the supplier retailer relationship, and anyone out there that's listening to this and wants to know more about it, please get in touch. Do you see that relationship has changed significantly in the last 4 months, and where do you see that supplier retailer relationship going in the sort of near to medium future?
It's really interesting. I mean, it's so. I'm just trying to give a sort of one sentence sum up, really. I think that suppliers are, convenience is more important to suppliers now than it was 6 months ago. It depends what you're supplying, but in most cases, it's more important. So that's really good for our sector. So I think that will enhance the relationship. It will lead to hopefully a better relationship, because there's more mutual benefit from working together. So I think generally that's good. I think the relationship's been strained by supply issues, which I don't think our members necessarily blame suppliers, but equally you understand why there's frustration they can't get the products in. So, I think that's been tested a bit, and hopefully everyone's thought more about contingencies, about planning, about how they can change what they do to, because if there is a second spike, I'm not saying it won't, so I'm not trying to be a doomsayer about it, but, we've got to prepare for this sort of thing to happen again. And also in particular with Brexit coming through, where, there will potentially be significant supply chain disruption there as well, as things are currently headed. So I'd like to think that probably loads of ups and downs, but the retailer-supplier relationship on balance will be in a better place as a result of this. And certainly in our relationships with suppliers and people who are part of ACS, suppliers who are part of ACS, we've seen a lot of engagement, a lot of commitment. So I think that overall, I think it bodes well for the future of that.
That's good to hear. And actually, that's kind of what I'm hearing as well when I'm sort of out in trade and speaking to people, is very much that there has been some shift in that relationship, but the majority of people on both sides are seeing that as a positive. Yeah. And so you say, obviously, your members are incredibly engaged, maybe even more so than previously. So let's finish off with how the ACS is now operating, because when we last spoke, it was very much same as absolutely everybody. It was a bit more of a survival thing. It was like, right, everyone's working from home and everybody's safe, and that's our primary concern. And then our next concern is about all of our members and everything. So what, since when we spoke in April, I think it was, what's changed since then for you guys, and what does it look like going forward for the ACS?
Yeah, it's pretty tricky. So, I mean, in terms of the service we offer members and what we do with members, I mean, we've received lots of really great feedback, and I'm not just because we have to say the truth, we have received lots of great feedback on the sort of information and support and the, resources we put out there, which is great. And that's we probably think a bit differently now, and probably a bit more, just a bit more optimistic about the things we can do for members. We've probably seen ourselves as being quite limited in what we do and don't do. And I think that still remains the case. We're not, as much as we're not a buying group, not a marketing group, I don't think that's going to change. But I think that in terms of providing that advice and help, I think we're probably maybe a bit more bullish about thinking we can do a bit more, and there might be some things we've maybe rejected in the past that we could think about again. So that's really positive about that.
And do you think some of that is because the level of engagement, but also the level of trust of your members, of you from your members, has gone up, and so there's almost that confidence there of, well, actually they do trust us to do X, Y, and Z, and maybe we should be doing more of it.
Yeah, definitely. And and that sort of, it's always nice when you see like a poster. I always, I always say, like, if the answer's a poster, it's probably not a very good question. It's more than that. Hey, let's just create a poster. It's like a solution to everything. But nonetheless, we have reduced a bunch of posters, and I think they're the right thing to do, and other resources. And it's always like exciting when you see one like in the wild. So especially if it's a retailer you never knew, and it's just like sort of, I didn't know they existed.
Well, you get to see where your hard work has actually physically ended up, which is great.
We saw a face coverings poster. Someone took a picture of it in a window in a Paul patisserie bakery. The Paul, which then we'd never really seen them as convenience.
No.
So, and that's great. That's great. I mean, they're freely available and everyone can download. So I think that cut through is quite exciting and positive. We're thinking differently how we operate in terms of events. Obviously, you've been at the forefront of this, about bringing stuff online and adding value to people online, which we've done a lot of ourselves. I think it's gone around really well.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure the future looks like a hybrid of more online, but then probably maybe slightly fewer face-to-face events. We've done loads of face-to-face events, so maybe slightly fewer, probably a bit bigger. And so when we do it, we probably try and really squeeze the value out of it. Yeah. But then there's also other things that work really well online. And we've been doing sort of webinars and inductions and showcases, and some of them, you think actually this is better online. This is we should be doing this online. So we've been a mixture of those things. And then finally, just in terms of like more personally, in terms of going back to the office and stuff, we're thinking about how that works. And we're August and September starting to come back with the aim of October we'll be back fully. Because one of the things for us, we've got 2 new colleagues that started over this time. 2 new people joined, so really hard to bring them into it when we're not seeing.
Imagine joining a company online and then staying that way for 3 or 4 months. That's just nuts.
But they've been fantastic, as is everyone. So we will, looking forward to getting, working with everyone a bit more, and because I think a lot of those sort of informal conversations is where all the value comes from, and we've got the benefit of being small, so we try to, we were talking before about the benefit of being small and making quick decisions, and the gap between the idea coming up and implementing it being short.
Yeah.
And we still do that in where you're working now, but I think some of that comes from the dynamics around being in the office. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that being a bit more normal. But I think the future for us will probably be a mix of home working and office working.
Yeah, well, I don't think that you're alone in that. James, I thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. It's always informative. It's always interesting. You always make me smile. So thank you so much. And thanks very much for everything that you and all the guys at ACS are doing for the industry, because we can see what you're doing out there and we can see how hard everyone's pedaling. And I know that everyone that's watching this will be grateful for your hard work. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Katie. Cheers.
Thank you.